Andrea Smith's article, quote, "Rape is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear," end quote. Rape is nothing more or less than a tool of patriarchal control, undergirds the philosophy of the white-dominated women's anti-violence movement. This philosophy has been critiqued by many women of color, including critical race theorist Kimberlé Crenshaw, for its lack of attention to racism and other forms of oppression. Crenshaw analyzes how male-dominated conceptions of race and white-dominated conceptions of gender stand in the way of a clear understanding of violence against women of color. It is inadequate, she argues, to investigate the oppression of women of color by examining race and gender oppression separately, and then putting the two analyses together, because the overlap between racism and sexism transforms the dynamics. Instead, Crenshaw advocates replacing the additive approach with an intersectional approach. Quote, "The problem is not simply that both discourses fail women of color by not acknowledging the additional issue of race or of patriarchy, but rather that the discourses are often inadequate even to the discrete tasks of articulating the full dimensions of racism and sexism," end quote. Despite her intersectional approach, Crenshaw falls short of describing how a politics of intersectionality might fundamentally shift how we analyze sexual domestic violence. If sexual violence is not simply a tool of patriarchy, but also a tool of colonialism and racism, then entire communities of color are the victims of sexual violence. As Nefertiti Tadiar argues, colonial relationships are themselves gendered and sexualized. Quote, "The economics and political relations of nations are libidinally configured. That is, they are grasped and affected in terms of sexuality. This global and regional fantasy is not, however, only metaphorical, but real insofar as it grasps a system of political and economic practices already at work among these nations," end quote. Within this context, according to Tadiar, the question to be asked is, who is getting off on this? Who is getting screwed, and by whom? End quote. Thus, while both Native men and women have been subjected to a reign of sexualized terror, sexual violence does not affect Indian men and women in the same way. When a Native woman suffers abuse, this abuse is an attack on her identity as a woman and an attack on her identity as Native. The issues of colonial, race, and gender oppression cannot be separated. This fact explains why, in my experience as a rape crisis counselor, every Native survivor I ever counseled said to me at one point, "I wish I was no longer Indian." As I will discuss in this chapter, women of color do not just face quantitatively more issues when they suffer violence, for example, less media attention, language barriers, lack of support in the judicial system, but their experience is qualitatively different from that of white women. Anne Stoller's analysis of racism sheds light on this relationship between sexual violence and colonialism. She argues that racism, far from being a reaction to crisis in which racial others are scapegoated for social ills, is a permanent part of the social fabric. Racism is not an effect, but a tactic in the internal fission of society into binary opposition, a means of creating biologized internal enemies against whom society must defend itself," end quote. She notes that in the modern state, it is the constant purification and elimination of racialized enemies within the state that ensures the growth of a national body. Quote, "Racism does not merely arise in moments of crisis in sporadic cleansings. It is internal to the biopolitical state, woven into the web of the social body, threaded through its fabric," end quote. Similarly, Kate Shanley notes that Native peoples are a permanent present absence in the U.S. colonial imagination, an absence that reinforces at every turn the conviction that Native peoples are indeed vanishing and that the conquest of Native lands is justified. Ella Shohat and Robert Stam describe this absence as, quote, "an ambivalently repressive mechanism which dispels anxiety in the face of the Indian, whose very presence is a reminder of the initially precarious grounding of the American nation-state itself. In a temporal paradox, living Indians were induced to play dead, as it were, in order to perform a narrative of manifest destiny in which their role ultimately was to disappear," end quote. This absence is effected through the metaphorical transformation of Native bodies into a pollution of which the colonial body must constantly purify itself. For instance, as white Californians described them in the 1860s, Native people were, quote, "the dirtiest lot of human beings on earth," end quote. They wear, quote, "filthy rags with their persons unwashed, hair uncombed, and swarming with vermin," end quote. The following 1885 Procter & Gamble ad for Ivory soap also illustrates this equation between Indian bodies and dirt. Quote, "We were once factious, fierce and wild, and peaceful arts unreconciled, our blankets smeared with grease and stains, from buffalo meat and settlers' veins, through summer's dust and heat content, from moon to moon unwashed we went. But Ivory soap came like a ray of light across our darkened way, and now we're civil, kind, and good, and keep the laws as people should. We wear our linen, lawn, and lace, as well as folks with paler face, and now I take, wherever we go, this cake of Ivory soap to show what civilized my squaw and me, and made us clean and fair to see." End quote. In the colonial imagination, native bodies are also imminently polluted with sexual sin. Theorists Albert Cave, Robert Warrior, H.C. Porter, and others have demonstrated that Christian colonizers often likened native peoples to the biblical Canaanites, both worthy of mass destruction. What makes Canaanites supposedly worthy of destruction in the biblical narrative and Indian peoples supposedly worthy of destruction in the eyes of their colonizers is that they both personify sexual sin. In the Bible, Canaanites commit acts of sexual perversion in Sodom, Genesis 19-129. Are the descendants of the unsavory relations between Lot and his daughters, are the descendants of the sexually perverse Ham, and prostitute themselves in the service of their gods. Similarly, native peoples, in the eyes of the colonizers, are marked by their sexual perversity. Alexander Whitaker, a minister in Virginia, wrote in 1613, quote, "They live naked in body, as if the shame of their sin deserved no covering. Their names are as naked as their body. They esteem it a virtue to lie, deceive, and steal, as their master the devil teaches them." End quote. Furthermore, according to Bernardino de Manaya, a Dominican cleric, quote, "Their marriages are not a sacrament but a sacrilege. They are adulterous, libidinous, and commit sodomy. Their chief desire is to eat, drink, worship heathen idols, and commit bestial obscenities." End quote. Because Indian bodies are, quote, "dirty," they are considered sexually viable and rapeable, and the rape of bodies that are considered inherently impure or dirty simply does not count. For instance, prostitutes are almost never believed when they say they have been raped, because the dominant society considers the bodies of all sex workers undeserving of integrity and viable at all times. Similarly, the history of mutilation of Indian bodies, both living and dead, makes it clear that Indian people are not entitled to bodily integrity. Quote, "I saw the body of white antelope with the privates cut off, and I heard a soldier say he was going to make a tobacco pouch out of them. At night, Dr. Rufus Choate and Lieutenant Wentz C. Miller went up the ravine, decapitated the dead Quahadas, and placing the heads in some gunny sacks, brought them back to be boiled out for future scientific knowledge. Each of the braves was shot down and scalped by the wild volunteers, who, out with their knives and cutting 2 parallel gashes down their backs, would strip the skin from the quivering flesh to make razor strips of. Dr. Tuner of Lexington, Iowa, visited the solitary grave of Black Hawk and robbed it of its tenant, and sent the body to Alton, Illinois, where the skeleton was wired together. It was later returned, but here it remained for but a short time ere vandal hands again carried it away and placed it in the Burlington, Iowa Geographical and Historical Society, where it was consumed by fire in 1855. One more dexterous than the rest proceeded to flay the chief Tecumseh's body, and then cutting the skin into narrow strips, at once a supply of razor straps for the more ferocious of his brethren. Andrew Jackson supervised the mutilation of 800 or so Creek Indian corpses, the bodies of men, women, and children that he and his men massacred, cutting off their noses to count and preserve a record of the dead, slicing long strips of flesh from their bodies to tan and turn into bridle reins. A few nights after this, some soldiers dug Mangus's body out again and took his head and boiled it during the night and prepared the skull to send to the museum in New York. End quote. In 1990, Illinois Governor Jim Thompson echoed these sentiments when he refused to close down an open Indian burial mound in the town of Dixon. The state of Illinois had built a museum around this mound to publicly display Indian remains. Thompson argued that he was as much Indian as current Indians, and consequently he had as much right as they to determine the fate of Indian remains. The remains were his. The Chicago press similarly attempted to challenge the identity of Indian people protesting his decision by asserting that they were either only part Indian or merely claiming to be Indian. In effect, the Illinois state government conveyed the messages to Indians that being on constant display for white consumers, in life and in death, is acceptable. Furthermore, Indian identity itself is under the control of the colonizer and subject to challenge or eradication at any time. And I'm going on to the next section, but I'm going to make this video separate, so at least you have this.